How do you top that just now? Good afternoon, Kuala Lumpur. So, these are not the slides. Wait, let me see. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stefen. Some years ago, I happened to be in 2 cities in the same week. The first city I was in New York. And during then, I was a young, aspiring photographer trying to find my place in the industry. And when I tell people I'm going to New York, everyone tells me, wow, Times Square, Wall Street, you know, the glitz, the glamour, Statue of Liberty. As I walked down the streets on Broadway, something that really called out to me. What I saw was not just people with big pockets, nice suits, well-dressed people. What I saw were people, the homeless, lying on the streets just outside Wall Street. They were there with a cardboard asking for money. At night, when I take the metro, and the subway itself is 24 hours, after 10 o'clock, a lot of these homeless people go into these subways and sleep for the night while the subway goes from point A to point B and point A again. And within a few days, I found myself in Kolkata, one of the densest populated cities in India. As we drove from the airport to the city center itself, it was at night. And what I noticed was there were a lot of people living, or rather, sleeping on the left lane of the road. So I asked the driver, I say, why are all these people sleeping there? And they replied, well, because they can't sleep outside the buildings because that's private property. This is the only place they can sleep, which is public property. That question always bothered me. And I always ask myself, what does it really mean to be poor? What does it mean to be poor? And that question really bothered me because I am quite lucky myself. I think everyone here who has attended TEDx today, you paid, 150 ringgit, right? That's quite a bit of money to be standing over here and sitting over here and listening to us. And I think all of us still use the word poor every now and then. Oh, I feel poor because I can't get the latest smartphone. I feel poor because I'm working through the weekends. I feel poor because I'm burning my weekend for TEDx. So, what does it really mean to be poor? Is it easier to be poor in New York, in a metropolis where it's one of the richest cities in the world? Or is it better to be poor in Kolkata, where you can sleep by the left lane of the road at night? I find that question quite hard to answer. But together with my economist, partner, and wife, Lin Hui Yi, we sort of pondered that question for a few years, and we came up with a few theories. And what we found is the poverty line is a standard that can be measured across different countries. And we distill it down to a single image. What you see behind me is 6 mantles in China. We started this project back in 2010, and we distill it down to 1 frame, 1 person, 1 day. The amount that we calculated using national statistics was 3.28 yuan a day a person in China. I took the money, I went out to the markets, and I find what I can get with that amount of money. So you get 6 mantles, you get a bunch of vegetables, and a bit of meat. And when we started this project, all we wanted to answer is the first question itself: what does it really mean to be poor? We got quite a bit of response. People reacted quite a bit to the photos. Some of them said we were cruel because no one can live with so little. And what we found is it was interesting. And so since then, we have expanded in the last 4 years to 21 countries across all 6 continents. And so I traveled to all these countries to find out what does it really mean to be poor. For example, let's go back to my earlier story. New York and Kolkata. Both populations are similar, they are in the millions. One is 8 million, one is 4 million. And at the same time, if you look at the GDP, New York is a lot richer than Kolkata. But the population that's living at the poverty line for New York is 20.3 from 9%, and for Kolkata is about 19%. There's something wrong here. Because if a layman is to read it, is they say the proportion of the people who's poor in New York is almost the same as Kolkata. So what's wrong here? What we realize is there is a big difference between developed countries and developing countries when they measure the poverty line. Developed countries use a relative poverty line, meaning they look at the normal medium income for a person, and usually they take a proportion, maybe 40 to 60% of the median income, and this forms the poverty line itself. And from the amount alone, they will take another fraction, usually about 20%, and this is dedicated to food itself. So in a way, it's relative to how well your country is doing. Whereas for developing countries, it is more on a survivability line, meaning how much do you need to spend in order to get a certain amount of calories. Usually this ranges between 2,200 to 2,600 calories a day. The difference is quite a lot. For example, in New York, in the US, back in October 2011, we measured that it's about 4.91 US dollars. When we did the project then, there was census that calculates per poverty line every single year, and it is the most proportion of Americans that fell below the poverty line since studies started about 52 years ago. If we look at India, this is what you get in terms of corn, which is about 32 rupees, or 60 cents US. Okay. And if you look at New York again, this is what you get in terms of chicken breasts. Same amount of money, 4.91 US dollars. Over in India, you get some chicken bones for 32 rupees for the same amount of money. In America, you can go to McDonald's and you can get about 3 cheeseburgers for that amount of money for the poverty line. And for India, you get something similar, sort of a burger, but a vegetarian burger. As we travel to different countries, we find that poverty itself is a shifting definition. When I was in Brazil, when I went to the country itself, I landed into the airport. I went on my commercial shoot because most of the jobs, what I do is I'm a daytime photographer. And so I undertake assignments internationally. And so when I have the chance, I'll piggyback the poverty line on it. And during the experience, I saw many rich people. I went to the home of a person who was a fixer for my client. And in his house, he had an army of cars in the basement. He had a helipad outside his swimming pool. And there was an elevator that went up to his 3rd floor bedroom. And what we calculated is at that point, Brazil is a developing country, but it's also one of the fastest growing BRIC countries around. And at 2.33 reais, it's about 1.23 US dollars. It's not a lot, considering a bus ride in Brazil is about 2.7 reais. So for them, it becomes a choice of whether you take the bus or you have enough food for the day. And sure enough, about 2 years later, the World Cup just concluded. But one of the news that really struck Brazil during that time was just before the World Cup opening itself, there were riots by the poor people. There were riots by the middle class because there were complaints that too much money was spent on infrastructure. In a way, the cost was pushed up. Bus fares have increased during this time. In Malaysia, it's an interesting case as well. When we did this project back in June 2011, we find that the Malaysia uses a household, per household income as a starting point for poverty. And it breaks down to about 4.717 ringgit a person. And this is what you can get in Malaysia. We did this project in Kuala Lumpur in one of the giant supermarkets, because we find that in Malaysia itself, one of the cheaper places to get your produce are actually hypermarkets, because the economies of scale, the wide networks of distribution has actually made hypermarkets to be a cheaper alternative than even smaller mamak shops. And this is what you get in Malaysia. You get some noodles, you get some hot dogs, and bearing in mind, this is what you can get one person, one day as a choice, whether you want to have 2 meals or 3 meals a day. In Japan itself, Japan up to about 3 years ago is the second biggest economy in the world, and they have always prided itself as having been able to build itself from ground up since World War II. And they are one of the most successful stories, and so they believe. And they have always believed that they are one of the most uniform middle-class societies out there. And in 2009, for the first time in history, the Japanese government acknowledged there is an official poverty line. And it breaks down about 1,600 yen a day a person. 1 in 6 Japanese were officially poor overnight, which is almost 20 million of the population, which is close to what Malaysia's population is. And there was an article by New York Times, and they actually went to interview these people who fell below the poverty line. And one of the misconceptions is often when we talk about the poor, we often assume that they were the homeless, they were the uneducated, or they were the ones with no resources. But what they found is they also found young people who had a good education, who are working 8 to 5 jobs, but paid below the minimum wage. They also found single mothers who were never supported by the society or the government up to that point. And they were juggling jobs with 2 children, and they were struggling by. When asked in the report, some of them said, well, I always thought I was just struggling hard. I never knew I was poor. It was an interesting revelation for one of the most powerful economies in the world today. And this is what you get with the amount of money, which is about close to 5 US dollars. Or you get some daikon, some radish for a day. Next steps. So where do we want to bring the poverty line to? We have done this for 4 years, and next year is an interesting year for us because it would have been almost 5 years since we first started the project. The aim is to map out a 20-year roadmap, and we intended to cover the same countries and more every 5 years. Because what we find is the poverty line itself is a shifting definition. It's not as fixed as we thought it would be, due to political factors, due to economic, and even the society's definition of what being poor is. For example, in Madagascar, when we did this project back in 2011, what we found is the poverty line for one person is about 1,300 Arari, a day a person, which is not a lot. And what we found when we were in Tananarive is that it's widespread poverty. About 75% of the population live in poverty in Tananarive, and about 90% of the population lives with less than 2 US dollars a day in the country, of 20 million. And this is also partly due to the fact, if you notice the young gentleman who is in the photos here, he is the Prime Minister, Rajolina. And at that point, he was the Prime Minister after a coup. And so a lot of international organizations, the African unions, actually didn't acknowledge this leadership. And so a lot of them pulled out support. And so this actually deepened the poverty situation in Madagascar. And what we found is, as we photographed the poverty line, we found his face being plastered in more than half the articles that we photographed this on, which was an interesting phenomenon. So 5 years later, or next year, when we go back, I think it'll be an interesting case because just earlier this year, Madagascar went through a peaceful democratic process, which the international community has acknowledged, and hopefully situation improves from there. Even Malaysia is undergoing a lot of debate right now as a country, because previously they were talking about using household income, but right now they're talking about per capita. The oppositions have come out to say that the poverty line is set as too low. And so it's a tight debate on how the society sees itself. And this is one example that we have done so far. For China itself, back in 2010, when we first did the poverty line, we redid it 2 years later. And what we found was quite interesting. It went from 3.28 yuan a day a person to 6.3 yuan, almost double. And this is not just due to inflation. This is also due to the fact on how China sees itself as a country on the world stage. And there has been debate. Are we a developing country or are we a developed country? Because after all, China is the world's second biggest economy today, having overtaken Japan in the last 2 years. And what we found is when we photograph the items with this double amount of money, the food items don't necessarily double. You get one more banana. Or you get a bit more vegetables, in this case, slightly better than the banana situation. Or you get a bit more meat. So as we proceed for the poverty line, we urge you to think about it and ask yourself, what does poverty mean to you? Thank you very much.